Okay, we are now going live on YouTube with Ananda Bosman, and we're recording. And this is Ananda Bosman. And we are looking at the July 20th, 2019 UFO portal and the 50-year prophecy of Xico Xavier that if World War III had not broken out by July 20th, 2019, we would have no World War III, and there would be a worldwide UFO flap around July 20th, 2019. And we have here a participant in that envelope, Ananda Bosman, who will, on August 21st, will be leading a global press conference, but who will bring us into the reality of the fulfillment of the Xico Xavier prophecy. Ananda Bosman, over to you.
Thank you, dear Alfred. It's always an honor and a pleasure, and to be working with you now in concierto. We are a trio in this effort of press conferences. And thank you. It was you who brought this awareness of Xico Xavier and his 50-year prophecy into light. As we are doing a global multi-metropolitan press conference, which is the international civilian and academic ufological community's response to the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force's preliminary report, which I thoroughly covered on June the 26th, and we touched upon last week. It is of essence to note that the report mainly focused on UFO activity from 2019 onwards. It was in March of 2019 that they got the equipment installed, but in the July window of 2019, the equipment was being tested to its limits. Hundreds of UAPs, which initially the media were calling unidentified drones, but now have been considered genuine unidentified aerial phenomena, as they could not pinpoint any source to them, appeared in the Pacific, doing all kinds of maneuvers, staying up to 2 or 3 hours parallel to the trajectory of the various naval vessels, and some of which exhibited transmedial qualities, unaffected if they were in water or out of water, and disappeared without a trace. No other Navy or military unit had any operations going on. There were deep investigations by the UAP Task Force through all branches of government. In our June version of the mainstream media UAP bibliography, we also quote from a source that researcher Richard Doland obtained, a reliable source according to him, and Doland's track record is pretty good, which stated that there was a statement in the classified report that Area 51 does work on exotic technologies. There are nuclear, there are water, hydrogen systems. A list of different exotic systems was leaked in that statement to Dolan, but that all of their test flights do not leave the premises of the Nevada test site, and that which was observed by multiple types of equipment in the Pacific was not an operation of Area 51. Of course, we know there are many other, or there are numerous other places where exotic technology of various forms and levels of classification are being tested, but it gives indication that the UAP Task Force was trying to identify through the different branches if there was a covert US operation taking place. The press conference that we're holding is a civilian-based one, an academic-based one. We have pointed to the three groups in the ufological community. The third group, of course, will continue pursuing covert black world technology behind the UAP phenomenon. Now, I was invited by Mia Ferraletto to join the Consciousness and Contact conference in South Dakota at the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation of the Lakota indigenous people. It was a beautiful gathering of many contactees, experiences, people like Whitley Strieber, Yvonne Smith, and many others. And so we each gave our presentations. I gave a presentation on the Friday, the 19th, somewhat akin to our super intelligence hypothesis, a early version thereof. And the next day we went to the Sundance. And so at the end of the morning hours, something happened. However, before I went to the Sundance, in talking with Mia and communicating with Mia, I always had this image of a UFO parked in the daylight over the Sundance, somewhat akin to what happened in Mexico, July the 11th, 1991, fulfilling a prophecy of the fifth, sixth sun by the Dresden Codex. From that particular event, which was filmed from multiple directions as people were filming and trying to capture the eclipse of that day in accordance to the Dresden Codex prophecy, multiple angles from different cities of that UFO was picked up. And this began the Mexico mega wave of UFOs, which went into fleets. Of course, the history of fleets goes back a long, long time. In our book, The Alien Presence from 1993, we already were able to list for hundreds of years of astronomer sightings of UFOs leaving Mars, Venus, crossing the sun, crossing the body of the moon. And the fleets have been seen in Nuremberg, and you can go back in history. This fleet phenomena is nothing new. And even the Foo Fighters of World War II would take, at times, fleet conformations. So the early 50s had the fleets as well. The fleet phenomena started to then change during the 70s, and in Geneva in 1991, you start getting this triangulation of fleets with different geometrical contours and formations as a kind of alphabetic language, which has been persistent in the fleet phenomenon. The fleet phenomenon then built up in Mexico after the 7/11 event, 1991. Two fleets joining together and becoming these organic snakes in the sky, like Quetzalcoatl, the winged serpent, and various other formations, which then spread to North America and South America. So people started to discover the power of summoning the UFO and focusing out in space, having compassion, gratitude, knowing that in this compassion there will be a response, and a response comes. This is something I discovered as a young man when I was 15 after a near-death experience. And this became a nearly daily occurrence. So the Sundance in South Dakota, 2019, July 20th, I had visualized this UFO parked over it. It was just simply there. Then as we were watching the ceremonies and our group kind of dispersed with the natives, which was quite a large gathering. We were not allowed to have our phones with us, and there were other rules which we had to abide to and which we respected. So feeling the energy of the Sundance, the linking to Wonkantonka, the great creator, I went out into space with a coherent mind and heart laser, was a clear connection, the presence was there, and I projected that image of parking over the Sundance. Several other people did their protocols with meditation, whichever their protocols were. And then the response came. The initial vehicle that appeared there was seen by members of my group to be releasing a plasma series of arms, and spheres were also released from it. By the time I saw it, the arms look more like scattering patterns. However, later we found films not far away, just across the border from Nebraska, from Shannon Kelly, who was a friend of one of the participants, Joan Bird. And she found his footage to be very similar. I looked through the hundreds of hours of films that he has taken as a contactee. And indeed, some of the footage was identical to the object we were seeing, which was parked there for 2 hours. It wasn't at the zenith per se, it was more towards the 1, sometimes 2 o'clock position, but this would shift. So either side of the zenith. As it was taking place, Whitley Strieber was suggesting in the first 10 minutes, these could be drones. So when one has a UFO experience, one also takes in parallel logic, the paralogistics set in. So the skeptical researchers said, could this be a drone that was running? Another parallel logic I chose was, could this be Venus? This is July. There is a rare phenomenon where Venus can become visible in July in the high sun or close to the zenith. So I wanted to examine, is there a precession going on with this object? So it was extremely hot, despite that there were winds. So we withdrew to a tree, to the shade of the tree, where I could use a branch to measure if the object was precessing. At first, it seemed that it was, but then after a while, it clearly wasn't. It was taking different trajectories. Someone with us in the group, Stephanie Finch, was also doing this examination. Much to her credit, she stayed there till the very, very end and watched the object take a trajectory and fly off away from the Sundance towards the All Nations Gathering Center, which is where we had our lectures. Now, only some people stayed at the UFO at the Sundance, because in the first 20 minutes, half an hour, we received word that we should all go back to the All Nations Gathering Center. I did deliver that message, but all of the group that stayed said, no, we're not going back. This was consciousness in contact, there was a UFO, and we had to see it to the end. I kind of resonated to that. I have respect, of course, for my colleagues speaking as well. I was not the driver, there were numerous drivers. So we watched that till the end, came back, continued with the conference. The next day, 3 of us, Kevin Briggs, David Cottrell, and myself, in the evening, it was dark, I suggested, why don't we do a protocol? We were by the teepees at the All Nation Gathering Center. We each have our different ways of getting in contact with our sources. So we proceeded to do so, some form of meditational coherence. Kevin Briggs, then, who is a contactee with communication, then decided to check in and go to sleep. David Cottrell and I remained, and we had several UFO incursions. One of which appeared directly above us, fully powered up with a beam at the 20-minute position on the clock before it. And then as it powered down, the beam went into invisibility and the object went over the All Nations Gathering Center towards the field behind. Now, looking at the Shannon Kelly movie footage with these plasma beams and the sphere attached, should that be illuminated during the night, it looks pretty similar to what we were seeing there. In other words, either the same object that we saw over the Sundance or one that is of same self-similarity. We went inside. Now, I'd forgotten this. I reread through the PowerPoint of Alfred, my initial report. As we came into the All Nations Gathering Center, there was several people chatting, having a conversation about something. But all the lights were flickering in odd ways. Now, I didn't remember that because I've had so much of that in my life. It's unremarkable for me. It's a classic aspect that happens with close UFO contacts. A bit later, Rebecca Chief Eagle, who was hosting us with Dallas Chief Eagle, went to the bathroom of the All Nations Gathering Center, looked out the window, and saw the UFO with a beam aimed to the ground in the field behind. So this is the sequence of the UFOs that were seen there. There were much higher up objects also seen, and there were other phenomena that occurred. It is something I wrote down immediately when I flew from South Dakota to my colleague Param Jill, filmmaker in California, because I know that one has to write down every detail immediately after UFO events because of the memory loss that occurs by the nature of memory on this planet. So I'm glad I did that because we got the details that were necessary, which I immediately shared with Alfred and my own general mailing group. I continue to have UFO sightings in California, some of which looked like other film footages of Shannon Kelly. And when I came back to British Columbia, we were at Roberts Creek, and they continued. So my whole family continued to see this rotating like UFO. And these UFOs that blink in many places at the same time. So in those first 10, 20 minutes, we were considering it. And Alan Steinsfield came to me and said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, I'm trying to communicate with it, and I'm familiar generally with a UFO. There is a consciousness exchange, but I wasn't getting that. The only consciousness connection was that I had the image of what was to be already in British Columbia, and that is what I projected out into space, and then it manifested that way. But when it reached 2 hours, tremendously high winds, already winds at ground level, and the higher up you go, the stronger the winds there, it held its position steadfast, slight variations around the zenith, 1 o'clock or 11 o'clock, maybe 2 o'clock position, and without appearing to be swayed by any wind. There were rumors of some drone testing by the US government and military, but the areas given were very, very far away in another part of North Dakota and another part of South Dakota, not in that area. Interestingly, we didn't know this at the time, the UAP Task Force report, the preliminary report that has been released, has a great deal of focus on July 15th to July 26th, where on a daily basis, the naval vessels were receiving UAP UFO incursions, and sometimes hundreds of them. The USS Omaha footage was accepted by the Pentagon as official footage. Some of the footages that were released were said to be genuinely of UAPs. Furthermore, radar data was also released to the public, and this was officially released. So there were high levels of UFO incursions taking place in the Pacific. But I took a rudimentary look, basically just over one day, of other UFO sightings in that window in July. And there are plenty of UFO sightings all over the world in that particular time window, including July the 19th and 20th. Now, July the 19th in North America is July the 20th when you start to get to Europe or India, Asia, Australia. Is even going 2 days on. So the July 20th date has a window where you can, for Australia, New Zealand, begin in the 18th of July, where it will be the 20th at the far east side. So in that sense, we have a wider window just with that date. However, we see the phenomenon plus minus 5-10 days is profuse. So there is a clear July window taking place. And it just happens that at that time, the UAP Task Force had all the technology to begin their proper new measurements. They didn't have this technology before, so it's 5 types of analysis. And so there were, again, testimonies of hundreds of vehicles, many different sizes, traveling parallel to the vessels. Some had trans-medium qualities, could go in and out of the water, had 2 to 3 hours, and they were far off the shore. So solid land is still quite a bit of distance, so you have to add more time to the vehicles reaching land, but they disappeared without a trace. So the multiple sensory data, not just video, radar, forward radar, satellite data, etc., was used over that time. So it's interesting that the present UAP Task Force report, it primarily started taking measurements from that July window. There are a few cases from 2015, 14, 2004. They didn't go further back because those had already been released. Another factor that is now presently on a hot conversation topic is the classified section of the report given to the Senate Select Committee. About the size of that report, there are many disputes. We know from the former Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, that in November he had seen a version of that report, which is many times more pages than the 9-page report that was given to the public. The 9-page report says, yes, these are UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. It doesn't mention anything else. It says it has 144 cases. 1 was identified, so 143 cases. 80 of those cases had multiple input data from 2019 onwards, and 18 of those exhibited behavior of exotic physics, which Dr. Jack Sarfatti, in his tic-tac-tech analysis or physics of the UFO propulsion, is suggesting is using time travel, and that is a subject unto itself. But that's interesting to note. Time travel was part of the propulsions, which will become important in future layers of disclosure up ahead. So there are statements by Ratcliffe of at least 125 pages, including satellite data, radar data, backwards, forwards data, and many other sources, very high quality photographs, high quality films, and the amount of daily sightings is still classified. The public does not know. That was his statement. He was trying to get those 125 pages declassified in November. Then there was the election, Great Reset, and we now have this new process where John Grunwald from the Black Bolt, he was directly corresponding with the office of the Director of National Intelligence and got a reply surprisingly fast. The reply he got was, well, the classified report is just 18 pages and 9 pages more. So he's going towards further steps to try and get the classified version available to the public. Now, we know from the head of NASA administration, Senator Nelson, that before he went to NASA, his work in intelligence, he read the classified report, and he said it was significantly larger. It had significant data points. Basically, he was tallying what Radcliffe had already testified to, and he certainly does not exclude now the extraterrestrial hypothesis or something like that. It seems quite evident that something like that is behind the phenomenon. So with him, there was like an indication of 76 pages. We have Pennsylvania professor Bill McGuire, who's been involved closely with the UAP Task Force process since last August. He has various inside sources and senators, etc., who have told him that the top secret version of the report, or the classified version of the report, is at least 70 plus pages, 200 pages of annexes, 14 films. The films we've seen so far are the very worst films. Some of these films are super high quality. They take 40 minutes of time to watch, very high quality photographs as well. However, his sources one of them would have to come out with their identity. We suspect that Marco Rubio, he has stated that he would get some of the classified aspects out to the research community. So we'll see on October 12th as the Senate and Congress recesses, and we'll see what other leaks come out in the meantime. So the report largely has just dealt with the last few years, and especially from that July 2019 period onwards, because John Grunwald from the Black Vault needs reliable sources. So Senator Nelson, now head of NASA administration, Radcliffe, and the attorney of Louis Alessandro, Daniel Sheehan, who's been the attorney of the Disclosure Project, of the Citizens Hearing on Disclosure for Professor John Mack, who was involved also in Iran-Contra, Watergate, etc. He says he's had 3 different meetings with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence on behalf of his client, Luis Alessandro, and that he was told in the last meeting that the classified report is 400 pages. So we are starting to see these different figures, but now we have people, the people that are out there who have their qualifications that John Grunwald can now reference in continuing the process to get the classified report, at least portions of it, released to the research community without jeopardizing national security, the technological equipment that might be critical to intelligence and wargaming, etc. And I asked him, the letter is being completed, also how the international academic ufological community can help in this process by placing pressure on the Senate, on the US government, to release these classified portions of the report. So we have data. We don't just have statements, as in the 9 pages, there are statements, but we don't have the data. And that data should be going to the civilian sector. Senator Nelson of NASA has now suggested that NASA will start to research the UAPs and also interface with civilian researchers. This is something that has already occurred in Canada. My colleague Jan Budnes, he created GARPAN, UFO BC in British Columbia, and Rudowski's organization are now interfacing with the Canadian Space Agency. So Canada has already done that. And that is likely to continue with NASA. I think we need to have a very solid academic stance on this, and we need to also be widely open-minded, but also systematic, so that we can take the small hair with steps and layer a wider disclosure and confirmation process. So that's the news at present. The interesting thing is that a lot of the data, a lot of the footage that is being actually released and confirmed is in that July window when the Sundance UFO occurred. So this aligns wonderfully and beautifully with Xico Xavier's 50-year prophecy.
And this brings us into the spiritual and non-technological dimension. And that is the spiritual and the non-technological dimension of contact and abductions is something that it's like never have the two met. The sort of the technical ufology and the spiritual, and so that in a way what occurred at over the Lakota Sundance and was a way to focus the Xico Xavier prophecies, and it remains to be seen, you know, what the ripple effect and what the impacts will be, because one of the prime orders of the nation states have been wars as a conflict, as a, you know, the permanent war economy. So
yeah, we see the UFO experience actually as a mystical experience, and in our series that we've started filming just before lockdown, called Mystics, which was accepted for Netflix, but which we haven't been able to continue filming because of the lockdown between US and Canada. We interviewed a brilliant scientist as a mystic, because he had a UFO encounter with his whole family and went inside, came back with massive advances in physics. And the way this physics has renovated our view of what reality is, what we are, is utterly mystical, and it changes everything. We touched upon that in the superintelligence part 2. And I also believe in this module aspect of superintelligence. They create modules, which is the UFO experience, and they are adjusted to different groups of people, even individuals, including the archetypes of that individual, the running archetypes of a family, or even of an area and a region, and are adjusted. And this has been seen in the work of John Mack, who found that transpersonal psychology on the abductee, embracing spiritual crises, would change the way that the physical experience would occur. I think there are different degrees and different modules of this. So some researchers suggest that there is a phenomenon, and it affects the central nervous system, so that the sensory hologram is changed, and then the module is created that way. I think that's sometimes occurring. And certainly there is I've experienced a psychoactivity from the UFO with whole groups of people going into UFO champagne, a euphoria with all cells tingling. My modules of contact have generally been positive. They're not always positive, but those who've had negative ones, who then go through spiritual crises and a transpersonal process, what had been negative starts to turn into a consciousness facilitating and cognitive enhancing process of meaningful amplification of meaningful coincidences and beginning of a spiritual dialogue. So for me, these modules of the UFO experience are interfaces, are icons of a much greater reality, which is really the bigger disclosure that is going on here. We're going to cosmic intelligence, super intelligence, intelligence that is so vast, but yet that we are part of, that our nervous system would blow out. The mystical aspects are indivisible in that way, especially the ontological being, the observer factor is randomly clear. But of course, in our work with dialogues in the Swiss Alps and other Alps, where we do field work and engage the UFO and get each person to have their own UFOs manifesting, there are protocols that have been extracted from scientific analysis of UFO portal sites. So Hesdal in Norway had 5 different countries with their equipments during the mid-80s onwards. And they measured that when the UFO appeared, the Hesdal light appeared, there would be an 8 hertz signal preceding it. And of course, I did a lot of research on 8 hertz thanks to Dr. Andrea Puharich. Andrea Puharich worked with very significant people, including Dr. Jack Sarfati, psychic Uri Geller. Psychic Uri Geller, around the same time as Sarfati, had a UFO encounter, and it placed a beam in his head. And then he had his powers. Sarfati in 1953 had his telephone calls from this consciousness computer from the future. And he's now modeling how to get the universal consciousness field into a technology or UFO, suggesting that the microtubules, the cytoskeleton, the cell skeletons, geometry within the nanometer, 4 nanometer for alpha tubulin, 4 nanometer for beta tubulin, is in such a complex process to be like a metamaterial, like the metamaterials that Dr. Jacques Vallée has gathered, had analyzed, those metamaterials that were given to Linda Moulton Howe that were analyzed, the metamaterials that Robert Bigelow has, and there's various analysis going on. The metamaterial is on an atomic level and is a fractal recursive system that embodies in complexity the speed of light in slower and slower and slower forms of the speed of light, requiring tiny amounts of energy, but also enabling the universal consciousness field to be embodied. However, beyond this, is my understanding that the various humanoid forms, and there are myriads of humanoid sightings, it's not just the classical grays, whites, Nordics. You have endless varieties. The grays first appear in humanoid literature in very beginning of the 60s. It's only later with military testimonies that grays start to appear in the 40s and 50s, but they're not evident in the sightings of the 40s and 50s. Lots of humanoids, including small humanoids with large heads, but they're not grays, but wide varieties. There would be commonalities. They have 2 legs, 2 arms, a head and a torso. They might raise their right hand. The UFO might have 3 appendices where it lands. There would be various forms of commonalities, but great deals of varieties. So that superintelligence is able to create modules. Some modules don't live very long. They might be a week, some much, much longer. And these modules also have bodies that are freshly created. As I mentioned in Superintelligence 2, Whitley Strieber, who always called them visitors, he didn't call them ETs, he called them visitors, was shown on a ship in his book Transformation from the mid-80s. All of these bodies in drawers, and the intelligence was trying to say it's beyond any of these bodies, and it would inhabit different bodies and show, look, now we continue in this body. You have the blue gnomes, etc., that he describes. And of course, we mentioned in Superintelligence 1, the testimony of National Reconnaissance Officer, Master Sergeant Daniel Salter, who was part of the Project Pounce retrieval processes of UFOs, that these are actually beings of light. They will create bodies, whether they be the gray gardeners or the Nordic, and sometimes we'll take them with them or leave them behind. They make their bodies from local solar system and planetary environments. And this type of information we were given as a contactee in the 80s in exactly that understanding. And we were published before Daniel Salter testified to this in 1998, which preceded his testimonials on the Disclosure project. So this superintelligence is able to modulate temporary or even longer term bodies. Of course, the superintelligence hypothesis, which we are introducing to the ufological community, raises questions of things like our reality. Is our reality a macro assembly of modules? And is that the same with each of the spheres of the planets? And so that's a subject we can touch upon another time. So the UFO contact experiences are really pushing us to the ontological foundation of our consciousness and being, and is giving us the clues of the language of cosmic dialogue, which is 8 cycles per second precedes the UFO. And it turns out by 27 years of research from the Heart Math Institute, Dr. Robert McCraty, Dr. Glenn Ryan, that the heart in compassion, in its most coherent state, peaks at 8 hertz and induces 8 hertz, the maximum creative state in the mind, where we are in all dendrites of the brain at maximum bits of information per second, 10 to the power of 12, which is galaxies of information. These are the most significant alpha, theta alpha threshold states of maximum creativity. And so we have protocol there. So anything by biofeedback that can sustain coherence of the heart, can sustain 8 hertz coherence of the mind, coupled to our ontological being, the foundation of our consciousness, using that like the reins of a horse as a laser, and then engage protocol to call the cosmic intelligence. That's what we've been doing with dialogues with the cosmos. And it's something that's universal, and it's also got a science behind it. It's not just a mystic methodology. This is a direct biofeedback evidential methodology. Furthermore, the same process would focus on DNA samples, even half a mile distance, and change the DNA by uncoiling or coiling, or even 3 changes at the same time, showing that this coherent state of the heart and mind at peaking at 8 hertz and 8 hertz is non-linear, is non-electromagnetic. It's actually acting as a time machine. And this has also been evident in the work of Dr. Chris Illert, who was analyzing the conch shell morphologies back in the late 80s. And he used Euclidean mathematics and geometry to simulate the time-lapse photography of these conch shells on his computer. So he wanted to simulate them as they are being observed. But with Euclidean geometry, they became brittle and crumbled. So he discovered this new branch of mathematics, the hadronic mathematics of Sir Ruggiero Marie Santilli, who significantly developed these new branches of mathematics after his UFO experience. With those new mathematics, he could model 100,000 different conch shell morphologies on computer dynamically, but they used 4 arrows of time at all times of their bifurcation of growth, showing that primitive life is using time travel. Now, this changes everything. We're complex lives, so we need at least 8 arrows of time. Time travel is integral to animated life. And examples were given of a tree at high altitude should not be able to take its sap up its branch. But with these 4 arrows of time, that's no problem. It is a time machine, a natural time machine. So time travel is a natural part of animated life. And so time travel is emerging from different places and from different fields, including that of the UAP and the UFO. And of course, this brings us to new thresholds of disclosure. What really is reality? And it appears that we begin to be able to interact with reality. The HeartMath Institute's work with random number generators and the heart cloud measuring the coherence of the heart sustained for a 20-minute period, and some pilots with the electroencephalogram as well sustain coherence. When they then focus on the random number generators, they no longer are random. So this demonstrates the beginning of a co-creator humanity, which appears to be the message that the UFO interface is steering us towards. It's giving us these clues. When we use those biofeedback protocols with sincerity for the best of all of humanity, for the advancement of our planet, in sincere dialogue, we get significant results, and we started to take new equipments to measure that. So this begins the process of the age of dialogue. And in my short tenure at the board of directors of New Observations magazine, I oversaw the edition that dealt with consciousness in contact, and my contributing article, there were two, my individual contributing article was that dialogues with the cosmos, with UFOs, is a new emerging artistic talent where reality itself is the canvas, and the brushstrokes are the coherence of heart and mind and consciousness of both sides of the cosmic dialogue. So we can start to look at this also as an art form that is emerging and reveals deeper natures of our living animate reality. So looking at the more mystical and spiritual aspects, the phenomena, the modules are pushing us towards.
That is so profound and dynamic. So how are we going to have these, I would call it a collision of densities. It's not even a collision of cultures. It's not even a collision of dimensions, but a collision of densities. As you know, there are multiple dimensions in densities. Yes. And we're having a collision, say, of the third density and the fifth density. And we who are now kind of intra and interdensity,
right,
are experiencing these controller organisms and controller entities who are attempting to control fifth to 12th density realizations and processes with third density consciousness and tools, and so the result is palpably preposterous. I mean, it's a living anomaly. It's a living anomaly. The things like the press release of the Pentagon, and the U.S. government is a living anomaly, and so how are we going to get to there from here? Is it only through the implosion of those third density institutions? I mean, can that happen? Can they just go poof away, or what's going to occur?
Yeah, we are multi-density. I've taken this now with this new branch of science. My colleague, Professor Sten Johansen, Trondheim University, has pointed out a dynamic system like the human body requires 512 dimensions per second to deal with all the equations that are occurring in the animated DNA at the microtubule level, all of the interactions at the same time. So all numbers can be generated completely and exactly by his 512 dimensional model, which fits on a 512 hertz keyboard, which is interesting because Dr. Andrea Puharich found that when he excited water, electrolyzed it, after 72 hours, it absorbed at 512 hertz, 8 hertz times 8 hertz times 8 hertz. And the dielectric of water is 8 hertz. And that happens to be the portal of the heart and mind and of the UFO as well. So there is an interdimensional message here. And after 72 hours, these amino acids in sterile water started to appear and take on fractal protein structures, which he repeated over several decades of electrolysis experiments with 8 hertz. So also a sideband of harmonics appears with a ceiling of 720 hertz and a basement of 360 hertz with 16 hertz increments, which is twice 8 hertz. So we made our musicological theory on that, which is 8 hertz is a universal tempering, because 8 hertz was passing through a vacuum, even a triple vacuum after 20 years, and multiple Faraday cages. The only way that can happen is if 8 hertz is orthorotating 2 times 90 degrees through Bell non-locality, through virtuality, everywhere and every when, in order to pass through that Faraday cage. So it's interdimensional, it's not stuck in any dimension or density. Now, in the new branch of hadronic mechanics, hypermagnicals and magnicals are new states of matter that have been made in hadronic chemistry. Magna gas was the result of this. This is where lightning could be simulated for the first time. And so crude waste oil together with salt water would undergo the plasma arc flow, and the usual Heisenberg uncertainty of where the electron is around the atom is canceled, and you get an iso lemniscate of 2 electrons, an isoelectronium it's called, which begin to fuse. They fuse into the nuclei. In my contacts with some of the intelligences, which relate themselves in the module of being extratemporal, time reverse wave, Andromeda, Galactic Council, Athena was teaching me in her module about fusing the electron to the nucleus, which would engage us to a more primordial body form. But now this has been made in 1998 by Professor Ruggiero Marie Santilli. Once you made isoelectrons, they cluster together in iso superconductivity at body temperature and even higher temperatures like those inside suns, unthinkable by the old physics. And that becomes magnicals or magna gas, which can be injected into a car. Total clean energy, even if it's from petrol or waste oil, it's 100% burn. Nitrogen and oxygen are the side effects, 5,000 times more energy. But hypermagnicals are also indicated in the vast complexities of the living genetic code, the animated, not the dead human genome skeleton DNA models. So each DNA molecule is 3.6 billion nucleotides that are all communicated together. They can't be reduced to a single quanta. That would mean 1 nucleotides. It's 3.6 billion animated together as an intelligence. So quantum mechanics is over for animated systems. And this is a hypermagnical structure in the core of the hypergenetic new branch of science, where at least 8 arrows of time are taking place when the DNA is not replicating. When the DNA replicates, it starts to go into the quantum domain, which means all the mind control weapons, the microwaves, the radiation can affect it. I think the present program that we're seeing, which we cannot name here per se, but you know what I'm talking about, where humanity is being infused with all kinds of external influences, has overlooked the actual true physics that has just recently emerged. It's been completely confirmed last year by the Einstein-Podolsky Rosen debates, which was international scientists in this new branch of physics, which has corrected the insufficiencies of quantum mechanics coming from World War II scientists and pre-World War II German scientists who were really pushing quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics has infested, it has possessed so many different branches, the spiritual, the mystical, the sciences, etc. And there's been a scientific obscurism of things like the ether, which changes everything, as long as you don't use ethereal winds. Also, people like Einstein and Fermi and Hubble did not believe in the Big Bang theory of the inflation of the universe. They, on their deathbeds, were still adhering to a continuous creation. These models have also been exactified in hadronic physics. So we have portions of our DNA that, when they are dynamic and are coiled, are in a hypermagnetical state, which would be equivalent, I would say, to some esoteric descriptions of fifth density. The Magnetical state is more like fourth density. Now, our nails and minerals, our hairs, are more third, second density. However, it should also be understood that whilst George Van Tassel began the public form of the Age of Dialogue by communicating with Ashtar in 1952, who wrote the message to President Truman about the UFOs that would go over the White House. These beings were not the Ashtar Command of later times. They described themselves as light bodies that could pass through each other, but that could take different forms. And at Giant Rock in 1952, 10,000 people would be there and would aim their adjusted headlights at the UFOs before there were any satellites, and they would do their pulse flashes, their jumps, their power-ups, their zigzags, as we are getting in our dialogues with the Cosmos work. Now, a lot of people were studying George Van Tassel, and this led to Dr. Don Elkins. And he took those protocols and he published a series called Light Lines. So he had these random groups where people could come off the street, they would do a protocol, and they would get these communications from Galactic Council or Confederation, and fairly good quality information. In my teens, while I was undergoing almost daily experiences, I was also having an outlet, which was the British Channeling magazine. 90% of the information I got went basically towards the rubbish bin or was shelved, but 10% we published, and has a great deal of self-similarity and consciousness cultivating content. The Light Lines material was pretty close to the kind of material I was receiving and other contactees were receiving. And it happened to anyone. The communication would continue to the street sweeper, to the cook. It didn't matter which walk of life. Then the problem came with Carla Elkins. She was not able to get the contacts, and it became very, very specialized, and they had to do more and more special ritualistic things. And this created a paradigm of duality, service to self and service to others. And this is a duality game of the dream. When all is God, one has the equal juxtaposition of service to others and service to self. Loving your neighbor as yourself requires one to be able to love oneself, encompass with compassion oneself, and in that foundation, be able to embody and phase, conjugate coherence to one's neighbor. So it's service to self and service to others at the same time, canceling the duality. And so it became more and more polarized, unfortunately, which led to Elkins taking his life. So we have to look at the sources of what is described as densities. We see with Dr. Gerald Light from 1954, who worked with the borderline sciences, that he describes the meeting of the Etherians at Muroc Air Force Base, now Edwards Air Force Base, in 1954. And he describes from the two vehicles of the five that land that the beings that first come out are light bodies. They're hadronic ether bodies, and then they spatialize into a Nordic form, but the lips are still a bit blue, like when a baby is born. They don't have any lines or fingerprints on their hands. And 250 different military personnel are there because of an ongoing series of communication projects, as we, I think, described in our Superintelligence 2 presentation, which stemmed from Wilbert B. Smith, the head of the Canadian Project Magnet UFO research project, where he put out a questionnaire to many contactees all over the world and selected 200 because they directly fulfilled the criteria of the questions. And this included George Van Tassel. So from Dr. Gerald Light's notes, the details of the Muroc Air Force Base encounter, February 20th, 1954, becomes significant because he describes the Etherians, this is a designer world. We have a greater intelligence, has designed this world. The real reality is Etheria. It's a universal ether state, which is now called the hyperdense universal media in the hadronic horizon in this new branch of science, hadronic mechanics, a total entanglement of all space once one goes into the hadronic horizon in the heart of the atom, and which has started to create technologies that enable a fusion from the electrons to the hadronic horizon, the magnicals, hyper-magnicals, which are different densities. So those beings in 1954 described that this total unified state then would decouple different degrees of that unified state, like decouple electrons, and create whole density spectrums of realities. So Designer World was introduced in 1954. In the anthology of significant ufological proceedings, which is adjacent to our press release or our general statement, we also link to what the NSA was forced to release in 2011, which was these 29 communications that occurred between 1952 and 1954, done in a 22-lettered alphabet based on the periodic table of elements. This document confirmed whistleblowers' reports from the late 80s of such communications taking place. And what I was able to find in my period of research from 1990 to 1993, before the internet, regarding that 1954 portal period, and the so-called artificial moons that appeared and was in the mainstream media at that time. The researchers were silenced by 1957. Professor Bagby finally published in 1965 and 67 his decoding of the signals coming from these artificial geosynced new satellite stations around the Earth. The psychics that were connecting, the contactees that were channeling, George Van Tassel was the first to talk about these stations in 52. They were described as Shah stations, as portals for other realities that could adjust and interface with our reality. Francis Swan, who was used by the Navy, you've got an Navy Commander, Admiral Knowles, document describing her work. She is communicating about those stations in 1954 in pretty much the same way. George Van Tassel invented the word channeling. Channeling didn't mean mediumship. It meant connecting to one of the UFO intelligences and channeling their consciousness through the nervous system as a transducer, as a translator, which is also interactive. So that term channeling has been completely usurped and abducted. So at the very beginning, at the onset of this beginning of the 1950s period, the consciousness factor and the greater spiritual reality that we're from, or ether reality, was downloaded. It's there, it's evident. Most people identify with society and social roles, which means in a locked series of personality clothes. Of course, the foundation of consciousness cannot be touched. And as we mentioned, when the DNA is replicating, having babies, 8 hertz creates it, but 8 hertz phase cancels the microwave, the radiations, etc. We know examples of this. There is a molecule called gamma harmine, which occurs in a plant called the wild rue, which is was used in the Christian traditions, Zoroastrian traditions, and the Vedic traditions as a medicine, and even the Arabic traditions to remove the evil eye. Now, the harmine molecules have a nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy of 8 cycles per second, which means equal phase conjugation, phase cancellation, phase kissing, phase coherifying, function. When rats were injected by that molecule and exposed to gamma radiation, of course, the controls died close to immediately, but they continued to live for the equivalence of 5 years. So this 8 hertz portal function is central to understanding the greater multi-density, multi-dimensional or multi-valued hyperdimensional nature of the animated system. The DNA is in a 8 hertz resonance system with the base pair nucleotides, but in order to have babies and uncoil, an even stronger 8 hertz must occur. When the DNA is then tangled and is in the process of recoiling, that part of the DNA is vulnerable to radiations, microwave radiations, and all kinds of different technologies and toxins and programs that can be inserted into the human system. And so that becomes an important factor as well, that the living hypergenetic core is operating in this much greater density with 8 arrows of time. It's called the hypergenetic system of hypergenetics, a new branch of animated genetics.
Right, right. So where do you think where do you think the emerging human consciousness is headed now on our positive timeline?
So clearly we have this darkest before the dawn. We've got all of the various Rockefeller agendas that were kind of looked at in the late 50s and 60s. But I think in this particular presentation, we don't go into that area too much, but that's a subject unto itself. So there is this emergence of more and more co-creativity. There are more and more people are waking up in myriads of ways. The technology, the biofeedback technology, it costs next to nothing. It's available in very conventional conservative circles. You have the firemen guilds who will be using HeartMath biofeedback to increase their sustenance of coherence, of compassionate love, in order to deal with stress or to deal with an overload in the situations that they have to face, the horrors in some points, so they don't have the freeze, so they can begin to function better in their jobs. And there's police officers, there are lawyers, there are judges, there are scientists. So you learn it by observation, and you get higher and higher levels of sustained coherence. You also observe when you see the sustained coherence, a part of oneself saying, "What, me? No, that's not possible." And you see that wave function come in and collapse the coherence, which is very useful for the individual to tweak their consciousness from the self-destructive components of the dream, so to speak, of the continuum of oneself, and be able to tweak the fabric towards greater coherence. After a while, you don't need the device anymore, but you can give it to a child. And my wife is doing that she's in the education sector. So children discover the fun of playing with an iPad, seeing their heartbeat and focusing on coherence and experiencing relief of stress, increased creativity. And then we can start to move towards new forms of education. But it's in the midst of all these other controls that are present being imposed on our education sectors. So it is the independent momentums that are clearly the message that is emerging here. We have to continue to innovate and co-create regardless of the external circumstances. And it appears that when one is in a coherent state, we have genetic free will. We can alter the outcome of the DNA, create it to coil or uncoil, or change in the middle, or all three at the same time. The control groups who are not in that state do not go over the placebo effect. So we are genetic robots unless we actually harness the 8 hertz sustenance of coherence in heart and mind. And the experiments have shown we interact with reality. So we can use those creative tools. always to innovate. When there is more and more impositions on apparently our free will, with a dead physics as a model behind it, their mistake, but they're into pedigree, some of them. We harness these creative functions of heart and mind, which are also the protocols of cosmic dialogue. So I think the interface with superintelligence and its modules is basically wanting to produce the end result of a synergy of Homo sapiens with Homo universalis, creating a parabolic effect from the synergy of both. So we're in the nitty gritty of a slow motion alchemical system. Now, of course, if we look at structures of mystery schools, secret societies, they have black and white brotherhoods, and the checkerboard of Freemasonry, or the Enochian checkerboards, or the checkerboard of the Egyptian magicians, of Tehuti, of Thoth. So in the Freemasons, I know in Denmark, when I was researching this during my early 20s, not only the UFO, but also other ad hoc subjects in depth, then a 17-degree Freemason was coming forward, and he went Christian and renounced the Freemasons. He described on the 17th degree, there's a ritual where the brothers are asked to spit and stamp on the cross. And so the brothers asked, and he says, no, a good brother will respect all spiritual traditions and will not spit and stamp on the cross. And off he goes to the white brotherhood. The other brother is asked the same question, and he spits and stamps on the cross, and they all clap again, and off he goes to the black brotherhood. And so the black and the white are managed by the 33rd degree, which keeps the golden middle way a secret. The golden middle way is first taught in the Vedas as the way that transcends the black and the white, that which encompasses all sides to the universal foundation of all oneness. So the golden midway path is used in secrecy. Of course, our foundation is a golden midway from crown to base, starting at the heart, which is our golden middle. So this is part of the architecture that's being played out. Now, Manly P. Hall from the Royal Council of Princes in 1933 was asked about what's going to happen now to mankind, and a 33-degree Freemason. He said, well, humanity is about to go into a collective initiation. Humanity at large is now the Masonic initiate. And when a Masonic initiate is in contact with his Buddha nature, his Mithra nature, his Christ nature, depending on which branch and which lodge, then the lodge will test that brother. Are they really connected? They will be attacked psychologically. They'll be attacked by psychotronics or radionics. They'll be attacked by magic. They'll be attacked financially. They may be physically attacked. They may be attacked legally, in all kinds of different manners. If they are really connected, they'll be able to pass that attack phase. And he likened it to the sperm coming into the vagina for insemination. The vaginal liquids attack the majority of the 4.3 million spermatozoa. A few make it, and they act like a hypermagnetical. It's like minimum of 8 sperms that act as if they are one, as if they're one entangled object, and they create the insemination. This is the birth of the new man, the Adam Kadmon, what Carl Jung called the Anthropos Rotunda. So that is their understanding, but the eschatological round table that has portions of this understanding have different versions of what the Adam Kadmon is. The transhumanists, of course, believe it is the fusion with technology. So there are many different factors that are playing it, white brotherhood, black brotherhood, and humanity at large now is the initiate. So we must also remember the golden middle way, which is transcending both the black and the white, game board. So we get out of this black and white thinking, and that has to be applied to everything we look at in the world. We have characters who play the good, and then they're replaced by characters who so obviously play the bad, and we get attached to these characters and their politics and their spiel. We have to remember the golden middle ground foundation upon which all reality is founded.
Whoa. Yeah, well, you know, we're now coming up to a very rich and unusual series of days. Today is July 20th, and on July 24th will be the last day of the Mayan calendar. July 25th is a day out of time, because if you go around the zodiac under their system, there was an extra day, and that was to receive gifts and to ponder. And of course, July 26th, I grew up in Cuba under the revolution for some time, and that was the day of the Cuban Revolution. At that time, I wasn't aware that it was the new year of the Mayan calendar, July 26th, but we're coming up to a very significant set of days, and the old order is trying to reset and to shatter humanity, and may just find out that it's shattering itself. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think it is face canceling itself, because it's trying to have a concerto of demonology in a way, by archetypal, psychological spin, social spin, but its integral precepts are not integral enough. They're based on a foundation of chaos, and also a psychological series of spin biases that doesn't hold congruence long time. Even though some of these plans unfolding have been planned by mystery schools for a long time. Rudolf Steiner appears to have been aware of this. He talks about this time as a period where some of the mystery schools try to create the eighth sphere, which is a sphere of distortion in his understanding. He has his own visionary system. Which would be governed by the Luciferic and Ahrimanic influences, but it was talking about a vaccine in 1840, I think, 1846, that would attempt to take away our spirituality and link us to that eighth sphere. So we are seeing key players trying to produce an interface of consciousness to artificial intelligence, although artificial intelligence that is not based on the universal consciousness field will always require the metamaterials of a mammal, especially humans, to maintain a reference. Otherwise, it's just cataloging everything from before in endless amounts. It is not having the self-created novelty and innovation. So there are these attempts that would appear to tally with Steiner's forward-looking views on 2020, 2021. So that's one series of schools that see that as the Adam Kadmon, but those are illusionary factors. His understanding of the principle of Lucifer, as I mentioned in the last presentation where someone was mentioning Luciferic influences, St. Augustine invented Lucifer. He was a Manichaean, he ate mushrooms and went through that initiation to meet the previous members of that society to take his body, but then he abstained from them. But he did invent this idea that Venus, Lucifer, and Jesus, the son of Lucifer, or the son of the morning star, is described. he cognated that to the branch of the angels called the Ho Satan, the workers of the Lord with the drawn flaming sword that oppose, that block the path, who are seen throughout the Bible, called Ho Satan. And the Essenes, of course, had these structures of 7 archangels headed by Archangel Michael, and 7 Satans, Ho Satan, headed by, for instance, Judith of Iscariot. So this black and white management, we see this black and white management in the Sumerian tree of life, and the Sumerian tree of life itself is derived from the Sarasvati River Valley cultures, depictions of these stargates, where Homo Universalis is brought through a universal sphinx, the Gisa, which then manifests the multiple life forms. But in the Sumerian version, you have the angels and the demons at either side of the tree of life, modulating according to the zodiac and the greater 88 constellations. So these are archetypal templates of an operating system, which is kind of automated. But when we harness our co-creativity through the coherent heart, couples the coherent mind with heart-will consciousness, we start to log in to that computer archetypal holographic system and can use it in balance through the golden middle path to co-create brand new realities. So the mystery schools have become echoes of a golden science, an omniscient science at the foundation of our being. And we are kind of uncovering that, the pioneers amidst humanity.
Well, I must commend you for having brought us through a virtual symphony of context and meaning. Is there anything that you had wanted to say that you have not been able to bring up as yet? Or?
Well, thank you. I did not expect actually to have gone into this mystical science, philosophical ad hoc, but we've done it, so it's done.
Well, in honor of Xico Xavier, I think it was quite apt. Right,
indeed, in honor of Xico. Wonderful, wonderful. So it's July the 20th. It's 2 years on from July 20th to 2019. You'll be presenting at the Consciousness in Contact on the 25th. So the continuum continues.
Indeed. Would you like to share with our audience how they can get in contact with your work?
Thank you, Alfred. That is AnandaBosman.com. Bosman is with 1 S, so BOSMAN. At the moment, the focus is the International Ufological Multi-Metropolitan Press Conference. But of course, we will be updating after that to many other unique functions. We're working with a team from America and Canada, where we'll be presenting to the North American people over 200 protocols and precepts based on a lifetime of experience called Time Body Lotus. And that's significantly developed since being taught in 1994. It's based on certain experiences, ultra-terrestrial translation technologies and contacts and many things. So that's another aspect. We trust at some point, we've heard now about August the 9th, we'll be able to continue to work with our colleague Param Jill and complete the Mystics series, the other series we were talking about doing as well, should things open up. I know there are tremendous momentums of people that are pushing back on what we've been experiencing since March 2020. And I think the cohesive, coherent spirit will reign through that. It might take time, it might take years, but in the meantime, we continue to innovate. We make small strides at innovation now with these treacles of so-called confirmations with the UAP Task Force and in the unification of all great academic civilian researchers. suspending the divides through the three branches of ufology and the subcompartments, working together in synergy, in distinction, in uniqueness, in the academic process to demonstrate to mankind and also kindle in mankind the detailed depth of this subject and how it touches upon a wide, rich nexus of fields, including our existence itself, our ontological foundation. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And we look forward to this journey as events develop. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alfred. It's been a great pleasure and an honor.